All right, so I want to do a little bit of a demo on how to do landscapes. I'm not going to do the full, um, highly polished, refined, beautiful vinyl painting, but I did want to show you how to get set up with this so you can get started and talk about some of the first steps you take when you're doing a painting like this. So to start off, I found my photo that I'm going to work from. Thunder Mountain, obviously, if you're in Sedona. And then I've got my canvas here. A couple things to note already. So one, if I'm using a photo, I want to try to match the proportions of the canvas pretty close to the proportions of the photo that I have. So like if I had a photo reference that was a square, then I might want to swap to a square shaped canvas, or I'll just know that I'll have to make some dramatic changes from what's in the photo compared to what happens on the page. So these are relatively close proportion wise. It's not going to be exactly the same, but it's close enough to where I can kind of fudge it in and make some changes as I go along and make it still fit the canvas pretty well. So another thing that you'll notice here is I've already added a layer of color to my canvas. So this is called toning the canvas. This is where we take a color and do kind of a light coat on top of the canvas here before we get started. Normally something pretty bright is a good option. A lot of times folks that are doing landscapes in particular will do a lot with reds and oranges, because what happens is when you start to get these greens in here, you'll get this really nice contrast that happens between the red underneath and the green on top. And I wanted it to be kind of a brighter, sunnier piece, so I went with yellow, and we'll see what happens. You can make almost any color work for that first layer on your canvas. So sometimes it's good just to paint something new there, to experiment and see what will happen. So I've already got this laid out. I'm going to be using oils today. I've been doing a lot of other paintings recently with oils, so I already have my palette ready. I already have all that stuff out, so it's kind of easier for me to just jump over to that. With toning the canvas, I actually did a really thin acrylic layer. As long as this first layer is really thin, you can actually use a really light coat of acrylic before your oils. Now, if that first layer gets really heavy and thick, then the oils won't stick to it quite as well. Okay, so we've got our canvas ready to go. I've got my photo. The first thing I'm gonna think about when I'm trying to decide on my composition, I wanna think about how I'm using the page. So I don't want my horizon to be exactly in the middle, which this is pretty close actually. In order to make it more interesting, I'm gonna push the horizon either further down or further up. So once I start painting, I'm kind of need to decide whether I wanna have more sky or more land showing up here. So I'll probably actually inch this whole range up here just a little bit higher in order to make it just that much more interesting of a composition. So when I'm starting off, I'm gonna be looking at my darkest values. I'm going to kind of gesture those in initially, and then I'm going to be thinking about working back to front. So I'm going to be thinking about the sky, and then this mountain range, and then whatever mid-ground I have all the way up to my foreground. That's the order I'll work on the page. And the reason that is like, say I get really invested in drawing the really beautiful tree right here, but haven't touched the mountain behind it yet. Now if I'm working front to back, which is not the way I'm supposed to go, and I get this nice tree in there, and then I have to come do the mountain next, I'm probably going to end up either covering up part of that tree that I labored on for so long, or I might find out that the tree doesn't fit for the composition, and I'll have to change it anyway in order for the other elements to work. So back to front, darkest elements first. All right, so I'm going to start off by mixing a pretty thin coat for my darkest layers that I'm gesturing in initially. So, and I can start with something like a brown or a dark red even would work in this case. So I'm going to do kind of an alizarin crimson with a little bit of brown into it, so it's kind of a dark, earthier color. And I know like I'm going to be covering up this color pretty well as I go along, so really what it is telling me where these darkest elements are first. and then they'll probably get covered up as I go along. All right. So let's use this brush here since I've already got it out. Mountain where I want it. I'm gonna have a tree coming in on this edge. And then I also have to decide, you know, with this photo that I took, I've got a lot of this parking lot section down here. And I'm not really sure I want to keep that. I'm not really excited about throwing a Range Rover in the middle of this scene. So instead I'll probably turn it into more of kind of a scrubby area, or even more kind of dirt. And I think that would still be a major improvement, so we'll see how that works here. All right, I've got my basic idea for how my landscape's gonna function here. The next thing I'm gonna do is gonna start putting in the sky. So let's get a color mixed up here. And it's always good to mix more color than you think you'll actually use. Especially if you're doing a large area, because if you run out, then you have to remix that color. Sometimes you end up with something that's not quite as, doesn't match quite as nicely as you'd like it to. So a couple things to note about the sky. We see a difference in value as we move across. So when we get real close to the horizon, you can see over here and a little over here, it's much lighter versus the higher it gets away from the land, it gets to be more of a deeper blue. So when you paint that way, and you know, that's something that can be pretty gradual. So depending on how much sky actually shows up on the page, you might not have a ton of that difference showing up. But it's a good thing to keep in mind as you work, because you can really add that much more of an impact into the piece. Now, when I'm thinking about adding my clouds in as I start out too. I might change these shapes a little bit as I go along, depending on how I want to balance out the composition. But I'm going to start off by painting this blue kind of around where these clouds are going to show up. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of get a little bit of that. So you can already see right here, like because I have that yellow there, this blue contrasts really sharply, and you get this really pretty color pattern already. So let's do that. So I'm going to want a cloud somewhere over here. I want clouds over here. That's better. So I've already started to change the shapes a lot from what I see in that photo. Because I'm thinking about how I can kind of play around with the cloud shapes as I go along. And I might do a little bit of a thin blue here to add a little bit of depth to those clouds that are about to show up. Okay, that's a pretty good start here. Now you'll also notice, like when you're using a toned canvas at the beginning, like that color will still show up through whatever you're adding on top if you're not being very thick. So you can see when the blue's real thick here, you get this really bright color happening. But then down here it was pretty thin when I kind of scumbled the blue out there. And so you have that impact of the yellow coming through and mingling, and it's giving us this kind of greenish tone here. So I might go ahead and start adding in some clouds. Now I'm going to grab a different brush. I like to switch to more of a round brush when I'm working on clouds. And I like to be pretty thick with the paint as I go into it. So let's go ahead and start adding some in here. So since I'm working with oils, you know, it's going to stay wet and kind of blend together as I go along, which gives us a nice effect and kind of maintains that fluffiness that we want to see happen with the clouds. Now, one thing I'm doing while I'm working, I'm remembering the fact that like I can always come back and revise sections. So like I'm not worried too much about getting really totally finished with all of these clouds. I want to get the basic shapes in there. I might find that as I work into the actual mountain here that the shapes aren't balancing out quite as nicely as I wanted them to. So I just need to remember that it's possible for me to come back and change things any step of the way here. I might even go bigger with some of these. There we go. Now, one thing I'm also noticing is this blue that I started out with is actually probably a little bit on the dark side. You know, if I'm looking and trying to get close to this image, you can see how light the value is on this blue versus how deep and dark it started to get down here. And part of that is kind of just due to the relative nature of value. It's always going to look different once you add in more of your colors. So again, we have to remember that we're kind of constantly changing things around here. All right, special studio guests for tonight who couldn't be bothered to leave us alone while we were recording our video. So thank you so much, Millie. Now she'll leave. All right. So I've got, you know, I could spend a little time getting a little lighter with that sky before I go too far down the road here. So I'm just gonna add bit more white into that blue that I already mixed. Again, that's another nice thing if you mix a lot of extra color for a large section, then when you need to tweak it and make minor changes, you already have it on your palette, so it's easy to kind of improve. All right. So let's see how we're looking. Oh yeah, I like that much better. So you can see this difference that shows up here. Now I'll probably go back in and clarify those clouds a little bit further on, but for now I want to keep moving so I can keep working up this process. So next we're going to move into this mountain. So where did I put my palette knife? All right. So I got Thunder Mountain here, so I'm going to start off with a fairly light color. Let's see, probably even lighter than that. Yeah, we're going to start off with that color and see how it does for us. One thing I can also do is kind of play around with my palette knife here for adding in these shapes. Because that'll give me a very different texture than I get when I'm working with just the brushes. So you can see just with this little bit how that spreads so much differently when you're using this palette knife versus these strong brush strokes we have in the other sections. Now again, I'm working with oils, but and I'm also painting pretty thick with this stuff. I know a lot of times when you're starting off with oils or with acrylics, you tend to be pretty thin. Partially because you kind of haven't gotten used to how expensive paint is when you add it all up. So it's a good practice to start pushing yourself to add more and more paint onto your brush as you go along, just to see how differently it starts to distribute on the canvas. So, and now when I'm looking up at these shadows, one thing I'm going to do is kind of squint my eyes a little bit when I look, and that starts to solidify them and make them a little sharper in terms of contrast. But I'm also going to look for what color these kind of move towards. And they're really kind of a dark purpley kind of color. So desaturated purple, but still purple. So, and I might even find that I can mix in to this color and see what we get. Now that's probably still a little bold. Let's put a little blue in there. Mix these together to kind of soften it up. All right, let's try that. Again, this is just my initial pass, so probably what will happen is as I get further along, I'll kind of let a section dry, and then I can go back in and get a lot more detail if I really choose to. But I just want to look for these large shadow shapes that are starting to show up on the mountain here. pinkish tone here to work with that. And I started with this really bright red and I didn't want it to be too kind of bold, so I'm mixing in a green with it to contrast. And you can see it starts to turn into this nice earthy tone once I do that. So I'm going to add in a tiny touch of white just to lighten it up. There we go, it's pretty close. All right. So let's see, we're going to have one shape show up kind of like that right there. Start with that for now. We'll go back into this other lighter tone and kind of bounce it out a little bit. Now, if I'm wanting to get really exact and close, then I would be good to kind of switch around with my brush sizes. I'm using a pretty hefty brush, which means that if I want to try to get all these crevices and nooks and crannies here, I'm not really going to be able to do it that well. However, if I want to go for something more abstract or something looser, then keeping the larger brushes is going to help me with that effort. And in this case, I want to keep it as more of a study and not necessarily something really detailed and thorough. So we'll just start off this way. And I've also got some greens in here. I might start sprinkling in to kind of really balance it out. You can see you get these kind of dirty areas where you have these little bits of greenery starting to peek through, especially this shape right here. So now when I'm making green, I can go for a green paint, or I can actually mix black and yellow and get a really nice green too. So there's my black. There's my yellow. And you see to get this color that's a little more of kind of a drab kind of olive color. In this case, I want it to be desaturated a little bit more, so I'm going to add in a little bit of this color here. Now with landscapes, one thing we have to remember is atmospheric perspective. And what that means is these colors that happen further away are going to be generally a little less intense and a little less vibrant than whatever happens up front, because that makes them feel further away. It's the impact of atmosphere happening between you and the object that you're rendering. All right, so I'm going to start adding this green in here in a few spots. And it might be a little on the dark side still. We're going to find that as we go in. But a lot of the areas I'm putting it in, I'm actually going to be mixing it with other colors that are there. So that'll help kind of calm it down and keep it from being so intense. When I'm working so wet, I'll find that like my colors get dirty really fast because I'm dragging one color into the next one. And so my brush can get really kind of messy. So I want to make sure I'm going back to that palette and redabbing and picking up more of the color that I actually want to use instead of letting it stay really kind of dirty. Let's kind of shade this area in and see what that does for us. Okay, so I'm going back to this red that I had earlier. I'm mixing it lighter and brighter because I want to hit these kind of front areas here still. I might even mix in a touch of this yellow because it's actually really kind of yellowish red here. At the moment, but that's okay because I'm remembering that it's still very early in the painting and there's time to make a lot more changes. So I've got my mountain range more or less roughed in there. What I'll probably end up doing is letting it dry for a bit before I try to go back over it and refine more of these shapes. So my next step is to really just start to figure out this foreground. So I'm going to want to go into more of these greens and then figure out what I want to happen down through this section right here. So let's start with greens. Now let's do a green right here. Now if you have a palette this small, you will start to find that the space gets kind of limited after a while, so you might have to stop and scrub off part of it before you keep going. All right, so I'm gonna start blocking in where some of my greenery is gonna go. Let's see here. Let's see, so I've got kind of this wall of greenery that happens through this midsection, and I don't want to keep it too solid. Because it might turn into this kind of a block for the rest of the scene. So instead, I'm going to think about kind of varying that size in a few sections and how I can kind of bring it forward or move it back in a few other places. I want these colors to feel a little more intense than what happens here, and that will help me create that distance between the trees and the mountainscape there. Like I said, I'm starting off with a pretty deep green because that's one easy way to kind of set these off in the foreground, is making them much darker value. We can already start to feel like this feels like something distinctively different than what happens up top there. Let's see here. I might add a tree right here through this section. And then I might add a little bit of scrub over here. And then I'm going to want a pretty massive tree on the right-hand side. Now, one tool that's a good thing to do is thinking about framing your composition with some type of structure or some type of plant. So a lot of times I try to end up with something either in the front right or the front left, and that kind of helps me place the scene and context a little bit better. So let's go ahead and get this guy in. And again, you notice like working over wet, it's going to start pulling those other colors into what I'm doing and softening up the colors that I'm adding on. So I'll have to go back and do another layer on top to really make it pop. Go ahead and mix some more color here. I can mix up a pretty bright green too that's going to sit on top of these. I can still go much brighter than that even. Because that contrast is really what helps it work for me. So let's get almost a straight yellow. Let's try a straight yellow in a few spots here. Okay. And one other thing to really remember is that it's okay to cover things up. Because we get kind of obsessed and precious with things that we spend a lot of time on. So I might labor over this mountain and be really proud of it. But if I figure out, okay, I need more space to happen in the foreground, so I need to make my plants bigger, they're going to cover up some of what I just did. And that's okay. That helps us see that depth, and that helps us kind of make all the work you did before works because of what happens in front of it. So you have to really be okay with covering things up again and letting it happen as it needs to. So let's just keep going with these yellows. I'm just going to kind of pop a couple more plants here, and then I think we're going to call it for now and see how that works. Okay, so all right, so there's really quite a bit more I could do with this painting. Obviously, I can get a lot more refinement to go on, but one nice thing that I'm already happy about is how I see this definite foreground with these three right here. We see kind of a mid-ground with these other trees that have faded off, and we start to move into the background with the mountain range here. Certainly not finished in my opinion, but I think close enough for you to start to see how we can really work with this. One other nice thing that happened is, you know, I talked at the beginning how I wasn't sure what I was going to do with this section down here. And after I got to a certain ways with that yellow tone on the paper, it actually kind of works as a nice kind of desert ground to sit in the foreground here. So I think I'm actually going to be able to leave that pretty clear and still have it be successful. So we're done in that section, at least for now. So that's it for intro here. Obviously you're probably going to spend quite a bit more time on your own painting and hopefully go a little bit bigger. This is a pretty small one, only 11 by 14, just because I had one on hand and thought it would be kind of a good fast way to work through it. So hopefully this is helpful at least a tiny bit, and we'll be talking more in the future. Thanks so much.